Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, I'm Philip Eidson, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Art of Procurement. And I really enjoyed recording today's interview. My guest is with Christian Lanng, and Christian is the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Tradeshift. And in my discussion with Christian, we talk about the Tradeshift founding story, and you're going to hear more about his journey within entrepreneurship, within government IT, and eventually what led him to found Tradeshift. And in addition to Tradeshift, Christian is also a member of the Global Agenda Council on the Future of Software and Society at the World Economic Forum. And what I really enjoyed about interviewing Christian is that he's really not afraid to share his opinions. He's also got a very strong vision on how the future of not just procurement, but also B2B commerce is evolving. And then he's building that vision into Tradeshift itself. And so in today's conversation, we focused on innovation. We touched on a broad range of subjects, including the emergence of a platform and applications kind of model for procurement technology, and also something that was interesting about the power of combining machine learning on one hand with remote workers to more efficiently execute tasks that require some contextual decision making. So a little bit of RPA, but also with a human touch, if you will. Christian also mentioned in the show that he isn't sure that procurement as it stands today will even exist in 10 years' time. So you're definitely going to want to listen to hear out why he thinks that. All right, before we start the show, our conversation was recorded live in San Francisco. So Christian and I had tried to connect over Skype a couple of times. Illness and schedules, they both got in the way. So on a recent visit to San Fran, I suggested we do the interview in person. And so I really like the flow of in-person interviews that I record because, it's really a lot easier to pick up on each other's non-verbal cues during the conversation. So I really hope that you enjoy the show too. Okay, let me roll the tape on today's Art of Procurement sponsor, and then we'll get straight into the interview. Today's Art of Procurement show is made possible thanks to the Procurement Revolution. And you've heard me talk on the show before about the Procurement Revolution. It's a week-long event taking place between September 26th and September 30th. And it's going to be delivered through a mixture of live and recorded content, aimed at helping us all challenge the status quo as we look to elevate the role of procurement. Now, the Procurement Revolution is free to attend, just requires you to register, and you can go to theprocurementrevolution.com, that's all one word, to get your registration. And as you go to the site, we've actually updated the site over the weekend. You're going to find details on a number of more than 20 speakers that have confirmed their attendance to date. And excitingly, we have a lot more speakers on the way. You're also going to find information on the 6 key themes that we're going to cover during the week. So for more information, that address again to register is theprocurementrevolution.com. Well, hi there, everybody. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm delighted to be joined in person actually today by Christian Lanng, the founder and CEO of Tradeshift. So Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here with you, Phil.
Yeah, and great to do it in person as well.
Absolutely.
It actually makes such a big difference than doing something over the phone.
Yeah.
So let's go straight into it. And actually, I want to go back before Tradeshift. Mm-hmm. You had a really varied career path to date. When I was doing my research from a web startup, I think, the .com days, that I think you exited, to then working with the Danish government. And I was interested, for somebody who's obviously an entrepreneur at heart, how does that match with working in government?
Yeah, actually there's a common thread through all of the things I've been doing in my life, and I've always been really fascinated with things that impact society at scale. Mm-hmm. And my first startup was actually in the mobile space. When the very first mobile browsers came out, we made a mobile browser.
Right.
And this was back in '99. It was way before our smartphones. It was like 5-line displays, monochrome. But the idea, the impact, and all of the ideas we immediately could see of this idea of having a browser on a mobile phone was, I think, an idea that was really massively possible to impact society. Yeah. Then later, after I exited that, I actually studied sociology for some years. Okay. And, I was really interested in the cross-section of technology and impact on society again. So how these technologies will change and impact society at scale. And then a friend asked me if I was looking for some consultancy work, and I took on a project working initially with the Danish government and later working full-time for the Danish government. And it was really fascinating because the Danish government needed to completely reform their supply chain.
Right.
And they initially went to market and looked at a lot of traditional technologies like EDI, scanning, and how they were thinking about it. And I said, let's wait a second, all of these companies you're doing business with, they have internet. Why do we start backwards? Why do we start with the last generation of technologies?
Yeah.
And everybody was sort of telling me, don't try to go there, don't try to do this. This is, you don't know what you're messing with.
Right.
There's forces beyond you. And I always get very stubborn when I hear that. So we actually built a digital peer-to-peer based supply chain infrastructure for the Danish government, and it was a huge success. So I really got hooked by the idea of the impact of procurement and supply chains.
Yeah.
And it's like a stealthy thing. You don't see it in the world, but it's probably more influential on the world and economical growth than anything else that you can do something about.
Yeah, you don't even realize when I came into my first job, I was placed into procurement. I was like, what the heck is procurement? What's a buyer? I don't even know what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
And then suddenly when you get into it, you start learning about all the complexity of it, but how much it drives of commerce really behind the scenes.
No, completely. And I think one thing we looked at immediately was all of the existing models were set up in such a way that they were charging the suppliers. They're creating all of these barriers. The supplier actually had to crawl over to do business with you. And it's like, wait a second, our business case is actually to be connected with the supplier. Yeah. Our business case is to be digital. So I think I was really fascinated, also, on a society level also, what is this friction costing society? What is it costing just the government to try to do business? What is it costing all of these companies? So ever since, I think, we've been hooked on, and obviously also what we do with Tradeshift today, on the idea of taking out the friction of these processes. Yeah.
So how did you make the leap then from working for the government, working for the Danish government, to founding Tradeshift? What was the founding story?
So I think with the project we did for the Danish government, we onboarded more than 90% of the suppliers in Denmark to the platform in 14 months.
How many was that?
That was around 220,000. So a massive, massive scale. And then after, we worked with the European Commission on a project called PEPL, Pan-European Procurement Online. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially about having open standards for cross-border trade.
Okay.
And back then, that was not a given. There was a lot of banks who wanted to own it proprietary. There was a lot of players that said this should just be private industry. Yeah. But I was very much of the opinion that we needed to have open standards for trade, like the internet, so everybody could participate. And when we're doing that, we started realizing, wait a second, nobody in the private sector is moving or changing. We just proven that using internet architecture and removing friction, we can get 90% of the companies in a country to trade digitally. I met with one of the first Skype people, and we started talking. I said, listen, completely parallel story from the telco industry. So we decided to found Tradeshift, to essentially go out with a much bigger idea, which is, what if we could take out the friction of global business and connect all of the companies in the world?
It's a pretty lofty ambition.
Yeah, no, and it absolutely is. You can say so. But I also think it's ridiculous that we are in 2016. Yeah. And even today, most supply chains we see, maybe 10, maybe 15% of the processes are connected.
Right.
And that's existing stuff. Yeah. Then we're not even thinking about all of the new possibilities, because as technology grows, we can do more. I was talking to a company the other day who's saying, can we capture climate data from suppliers? And it's just one vertical where you can suddenly do much value add to your process. So I think the idea that digital connectivity can underpin all of your processes is still massively important for all of these companies.
Do you think that, because in the consumer space that's becoming more and more prevalent, will it take time for enterprise to catch up? Is there a kind of a wall that enterprise needs to jump over because there's a fear of change?
I think there's some fear of change. I also think, and I'm going to be a little harsh now, I think there is the industry of incumbents that have been very happy selling good enough.
Right.
So they've been out there saying, if you digitize 10% of your suppliers, you get 50% of your volume. Yeah. Just focus on the invoices. It's been very sort of tactical, operational stuff. And I think meanwhile, a lot of these companies are now in strategic trouble. I mean, if you look at the big Fortune 500, it's not a given that all of them is going to be here in the next 10 years.
No, there's such a churn of even large companies these days.
Exactly. So I think it's becoming more and more strategic what you're doing with your supply chain. Mm-hmm. I think if you look at the parallel to the consumer space, right? Today, we could not imagine not being connected.
Right.
I mean, most of our communication, most of our consumer processes, most of our consumer apps are all built on the notion that we are connected.
Yeah. We all have our phones and our laptops on the table here. It's like
exactly,
you're never far away from anything.
In China, where we're doing a lot, I'm just fascinated with an app like WeChat. Yeah. WeChat is essentially an operating system for consumers. Mm-hmm. I can, get tickets for the cinema. I can pay at McDonald's, get train tickets, communicate with my friends. I can do everything off one connected app, right? And I think we're moving there with business.
Yeah.
And I think it will be actually like a tidal wave. I don't think it will be a slow incremental change. I think it will be a build-up. And then you'll see it happen very, very fast.
That's interesting you say that, because most of the time, certainly when you think of procurement, we're not, and I say this, as a career procurement person, so people can throw stones at me if they like. We're slow to change.
Yeah.
And we change when we're kind of forced to change when there's no alternative. There's very few kind of trailblazers out there. So in my mind, I would always think, well, there's all this technology that even exists today. But it's going to take a long, long time for procurement to actually, as a community, not as an individual company, because obviously companies are at a different place on the continuum, as a community to kind of evolve to take on some of these new technologies. You think that might not be the case? It might be, an event of some sort, or...
I actually think it is, and I think it's already happening. There's a rule of thumb that a technology needs to be 10 times better than the previous one to generate a paradigm shift.
Okay.
And I think if you look at, I can take a recent North American customer, it's a very well-known shoe brand. Mm-hmm. Before we took them on, 5% of their supply chain was digitized. Right. Today it's 97%. Wow. The difference is they now have real-time cost data every 3 minutes. They used to know every 2 months. And the follow-on effects of that, not just in procurement, but in account payable, in treasury, where they now can do real-time currency hedging, in all of these other areas, it's just massive.
Right.
And I think you got to get to that level of paradigm shift to really move the needle, or else you're just doing incremental changes, and then you're right. Then it's like, why should we do this?
Yeah, there's not enough change to make it the whole change management associated with worthwhile.
Exactly, but I think the other thing, and I think maybe that's also what we can talk about later when we get to some of the skills and AI stuff. The other thing is, I don't think, and this is a very radical perspective, I don't think most Fortune 500 companies will have back offices in 10 years.
Right.
I think the idea that you have a procurement department, that you have all of these cost centers that are not contributing to the top line, is just going to be gone. If you look at most startups in Silicon Valley, the operational side is tiny.
Right.
And we are automating our way, or digitizing our way out of most things. Yeah. And so I think, we got to pivot. We're going to pivot that function to essentially become strategic, to become a revenue driver. And I think if procurement resists, probably other people will do it for them. Right?
And that's a very good point. This is something that I say to folks who I'm talking about technology is, and a lot of what I try and do with the show is to try and just bring some understanding that if we stand still, then the world around us is going to change. Our decisions will be made by a CEO or a CIO against our will, but without us even being in the room. Yeah. That, well, do you know that these technologies exist? We don't even need these guys. What are they doing? So we need to actually be with the CEO, with the CIO, as a team, kind of talking about how we can use these technologies to better our organization, rather than just letting it impact us and not really having a say in what the end outcome looks like.
No, absolutely. And I think one thing that's changed dramatically even over the last few years is the core KPI for what's important for the CEO has shifted. So in the 90s, in the 2000s, it was a great time. Most companies grew 15-20% year over year, just with a little luck. Shareholders was happy. Of course, we had a 2008 dip, all of that, but still. But one of the things, so most software, most processes was set up to just support that. Yeah. Shave off some more cost, and you make shareholders happy. But today is very different, and I'll take one example. 5 years ago, there was 3 surfer dudes on the beach in LA that were tired of paying $30 for a pack of razors. So they launched a company called Dollar Shave Club. Yeah. razors in China, sold them online for $1 up to $9 for a premium package. Made a really funny video called, our blades are bleep great. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go on YouTube and look for it. And 3 years later, they had 52% of the online market for razors in North America. 52%. That's a $13 billion category that's owned by one of the biggest consumer packaged goods in the world. And
that has owned that market
completely.
since year zero.
Yeah, they had total dominance in one market, right? Yeah. And then I started digging into the case. Why didn't they react, right? Why did they let them get there? And there was two things. First off, they didn't recognize the threat early enough. Yeah. And when they did recognize the threat, it took them 24 months to act.
Right.
Why? Oh, they had a very good procurement process. They put everything out to tender. Yeah. They went and found the right providers. They did everything by the book. The problem was just the procurement process was set up to save them maybe 5 to 10%. But the problem was what they should have focused on was speed.
Right.
And today, speed will cost you your business. Yeah. Where 5 to 10% cost savings won't really matter a whole lot if you lost your a whole vertical, right?
When there's so few in a space like that, and in a lot of spaces now, there's so few barriers to entry.
Yes, exactly.
That new competitors can come from nowhere, and all of a sudden they've taken, like Dollar Shave Club. Yeah. 5-10 years later, they're 50% of the market or whatever. And
I think so if you go back to procurement, right? I think we always say, procurement's job is to get the right goods at the right price at the right time and quality, right? I think we kind of forgot most of those and said, it's really mostly about the right price and hope people don't complain too much about quality, right? But today, I think the most important parameter for procurement is what's the cost of change.
Right.
And how do we set up our contracts? How do we set up our processes? And how do we set up our buying so we can very rapidly change priorities and we can very rapidly source new vendors, right? I think that's one huge trend coming in. I think the other big trend coming in is around the mix of services, direct and indirect, right? And so because when you're buying like that, you got to stop buying commodities. And I was talking to a CPO who said, I always used to buy 10,000 drill bits. Yep. And I stopped. I don't buy drill bits anymore. I was like, oh, wow, what do you do? Did you find a way to not have drill bits? Right. He said, no, I'm buying 10,000 holes. And I'm specifying the quality.
Interesting. Yeah.
So he moved from buying a commodity to buying an outcome. Yeah. And that's a very different buying process. Yeah. So I think when procurement is changing, our systems also need to change. And that's where Tradeshift, that's right at our lane. We're trying to build those systems for the future, right?
So when you founded Tradeshift and as you've evolved, obviously you're not the first player in the P2P space, you're not the last, because it seems like hardly a week goes by when there's not somebody else who comes up with some platform. What was it that you wanted to do differently, where you thought, there's an opportunity in this market for somebody who is maybe a little bit more agile, or that has a different view of the world? What is that worldview?
So I think, going back, I was sort of anchoring on what we just talked about. I think our belief was the future of procurement looked very differently from the past. Yeah. And I think even some of the more modern solutions, cloud-based solutions, are essentially just carbon copies of what was before, maybe with a little nicer UI. Yeah. I won't mention any names, but they're about to IPO. But I think if you look at the future, it's radically different processes. And I think that was one opportunity we saw. The second opportunity we saw was if you're connecting all of your suppliers, if you're connecting 100% of your supply chain digitally, what you can do is radically different. Yeah. You have real-time data. You can roll out new processes with a push of a button. Now when we are working with one of our very large customers in the shoe industry, they can actually push a new process every week. Right. And they can see the week after what's the impact. So they can be very agile, right? They can monitor on the contracts.
It's like you're split testing your process.
Exactly, yeah. A/B testing on procurement, right? Yeah. And I think you've got to be radically data-driven. I think you're going to think very much like your data scientists and maybe not so much as you're just hard negotiators, right? So I think that was sort of the opening in the market. Very few companies had managed to drive 100% digitalization. And very few companies, I think, had seen the pivot that's happening for where we are going. Now, from our side, we focus on, whenever we build software, tearing the process apart and going to first principles and saying, what is this really what we're doing? And can we get rid of this? Can we get rid of this? Can we get rid of...
So you're looking at the outcome first and then trying to build a path to that outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll take an example. A lot of procurement people, they'll gasp in horror, or, and that's approvals. So approvals is one of my pet peeves.
Right.
Approvals cost a ton. Running an approval process costs a ton of money and do very little for compliance. So, in fact, we're doing way too many approvals. And I mean organizations who have 3 or 4 levels of approvals.
Yeah.
And when you calculate the cost of that process, and when you calculate that in 99% of the cases people are just going to say yes, it's essentially a waste of time, and it's a waste of money.
And you have the same person approving things 3 times.
Exactly, yeah. So what we started looking at saying, why don't we approach this scientifically? What we want to avoid is fraud.
Yeah.
So that's a statistical problem. So why don't we do random sampling instead? So why don't we just attack all of the documents that come in and apply random sampling to have approvals on a random sample, and we can calculate exactly how big that sample needs to be to get the same outcome of asking every single person in your company 4 times.
You talked about thinking more like a data scientist. Can you then take the data to then find flags within transactions which would then say those are the ones you need to focus on?
Absolutely, right. And I think that's the other thing. So in the procurement world and also in the account payable world, we're extremely document obsessed. Right. My favorite is always when I ask people, what's the business process? And they show me a bunch of invoices and purchase orders and quotes. That's not a business process. That's a bunch of documents. Yeah. The business process is your people talking to the vendor talking to their people, figuring out how we deliver the outcome you need. Yeah. The other stuff, that's just results of the business process, if you want. So when we talk about software, we took all of those documents, we mapped them into the software, and we got stuff like 2- and 3-way matching. But instead, we should be looking at what I call 1,000-way matching. We should look at all of the data points around a single transaction. Right. So we should look at random sampling inside the organization of approvals. We should look at past track history of that vendor. Yeah. We should look at external data sources. Yeah.
And maybe even the history of the requisitioner.
Absolutely. And then we make a data-driven decision. Yeah. And it's not about 2-way matching, it's not about 3-way matching, it's about having the best statistical model for driving compliance. Right. And I think we got it all backwards. We forced a process that worked well for paper into a digital format. Instead of saying to ourselves, what can we do with digital we could never do with paper, right? And and we have the data to back this, right? We can prove that the way we run our digital process generate less fraud, more compliance, and less cost.
Now, is it just because, so that becomes an option now, is it because it's a lower cost to build a solution that does that, or it just is a mindset shift, that people just didn't think that way now, and there's an evolution in the way that you think about approaching these challenges? So
I think, it's very much about proof points, right? So we often start by having full approval and full approval workflows running for the customer, and then we show them to say, just so you know, here we can show you how much you would need to do. You could actually roll back your approvals 50%. Right. By doing that, you would save this much time for your organization, and this is the statistical variance you would have in compliance, which is 0 to nothing. And in a way, actually, by having random sampling, you, for instance, make fraud harder, because fraud relies very often on knowing who's going to approve. Right. But not knowing if you're going to have somebody approve or not, are you going to go to an algorithm, or you're going to go to another person you didn't expect, make that much harder. Mm-hmm.
I want to, just cognizant of the time, move a little bit into some specific use cases of the technology, but also, backing up a little bit, the notion of platform and apps. And, it's something that I believe in, because I think, we look at our phones, again, we have our phones out, and you have a device and an operating system, and then we have 20 different apps that do very different things, but all kind of tie in with each other. It seems to me that the future, really, of technology from a procurement space is that there's no one size fits all. Very different companies, very different sizes, very different industries need very different things from a technology suite. So the choice is you either buy one thing that does some things well but doesn't necessarily do everything, and you don't necessarily need everything that it does, or you buy the individual modules that you want and plug them all together. That's from afar what I've seen, what you've been approaching, the way that you've been approaching. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and kind of how you got to the point where you thought that made sense.
It was ironic compared to what we just discussed. It was paper who clued me in, because originally in business, we had one platform, one common platform. All of our systems was running off, and that was paper.
Yep.
And our process was actually pretty uniform because paper was all carried the same way, was all moved the same way, was all handled the same way.
Maybe it's a different size depending if you're in
Yes.
Europe or the States.
Yeah, absolutely, right? But then as we started digitizing, we didn't digitize it broadly. We started tying every single little process into its own application. So we got all of these data silos running, right? We had one process for account payable, another one for procurement, a third one for treasury, demand planning, forecast, ethical work statement from workers in the supply chain, W-9s, etc. Yeah. And we met with customers where the supplier, I'm not kidding, had 20 different logins to do business with that customer.
Wow.
And it's just insane.
Right.
and especially, so what we were saying is that, no, we got to go back, say they all have one thing in common, all of these tools, which is they need to communicate between the buyer and the seller.
Yeah.
Let's create, just like we do in the consumer space, a universal platform that can take care of document transaction, that can take care of collaboration, authenticity, security, tax compliance, these things. And that's the basic platform we provide. And then we have some core services like procurement, so source to pay from Tradeshift, risk management, supply management, and account payable, which is sort of driving the business case. But it doesn't stop there. So next time you have to go digitize a process, let's say you want to do cash flow management. Yeah. Instead of running that out separate to the solution you just bought, having all of the cost of onboarding your supply chain again, you just activate an app on the platform, and you invite all of the existing suppliers to join. I call the previous generation of SaaS solutions, I call them single-player tools, because they all built for one purpose. It's like your feature phone, your Nokia before your iPhone, right? Yep. And today, with Tradeshift, we're seeing more and more customers. They're essentially reusing that value. They're reusing the platform, right? But one more thing is, it doesn't just cover the third-party apps we have on the platform from like Citibank or C2FO and all of these companies. It also covers all the things that are unique to the customer. Yeah. Like the example we talked about before. Oh, we're in agriculture. We would like to do something around climate data. Yeah. Or we actually are collecting all of this special data around water usage from our supply chain. And the IT department can then get involved and actually build their own apps on the platform and push them into the supply chain as well. So I think tremendously powerful and clearly the future of this.
So I always like to use the term, and maybe it's not a good term, but this is because I come from both a service provider and a practitioner perspective of having a single throat to choke. So under that kind of model, is it the app provider? Is it Tradeshift as the platform provider? Where do you go when things go wrong?
So I think that's actually the really good thing is you have one contract, you're dealing with us. Yeah. And that means that's just like when you're activating your iPhone from Apple, there's a set of terms and conditions, right? Now the individual apps, they can have certain rights, data they need to access. We handle all of that for our customers as part of our customer service relationship. So you have one interface. Yep. And that's actually the beauty of it, right? So it sits just between, what we called, the best of suite strategies in the past, like Ariba and other players, and the best of breed strategies, which always came with integration problems, managing multiple contracts. Right. So here you have the flexibility of having one connected platform, one contract, but also the flexibility to use different tools for different processes. Yeah. And one thing, for instance, like RFPs, right? Like, there's no size fit all for RFPs. Right. Some areas of your business needs really complex RFPs with very, very detailed processes. Other areas of your business just need a very simple tool that can get the job done, right? And that's where Tradeshift we have like 4 or 5 different apps for RFPs. So it's really which one fits your process best, right?
Yeah, and it could even be which one fits whatever you're buying.
Exactly.
So you have different ones for different types of purchases.
Yeah, absolutely. The same with the visualization of, let's say, spent data. Exactly the same thing, right? You can go in and you can activate different solutions and get different outcomes, right?
So what are the biggest challenges then? Because obviously to a lot of folks, and then especially for larger companies, a larger company is probably more likely, at least in my mind, to go and take a less progressive approach in terms of something they already know. What are the biggest challenges that you hear from CPOs when you're talking about this philosophy to them and executing it? And how do you kind of convey or make them comfortable with this approach?
So I think one of the things we talk a lot about is agility. And we talk about, again, going back to the introduction, the changing demands on the procurement profession and where the whole field is going. Yeah. And then we don't come in and we talk a lot about technology. I mean, we do compare it to your smartphone. Wouldn't you rather have flexibility? Yeah. How many times have you bought a platform, then 4 years later you were running out of options? Yeah. Wouldn't you much rather have the ability to go and be able to extend or put new processes on it? What's the cost for you in onboarding your supply chain? Yeah. Why do you keep doing that over and over? Right. So I think obviously one thing that most CPOs understand is the economical argument, right? Yeah. What's the cost of this and what's the friction? But secondly is they actually have one neck to choke. There's one contract. So we've actually seen pretty big uptake among the largest companies on the platform model. But it's very clearly we are always delivering for a business outcome, right? So it is the procurement process, supplier management process, or account payable process that's always our starting point. And it can be all of them, it can be one of them. That's the focus for the project, right?
So you say that that's the starting point, but you mentioned earlier about the fact how you're evolving from there in terms of you can cover the entire part of the purchasing continuum, the value chain. One of the things I was interested about is skills. And starting to look at it to buy people, essentially, to buy expertise as well as just, facilitating transactions. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Is this a new model for an MSP?
I think it's going to be a new model for a lot of people. Yeah. And I think it is essentially unavoidable. Right. So what Tradeshift skills do is it enables a procurement department or essentially any company to access skills through the Tradeshift platform that they don't have internally. So to give a very concrete example, you might be a procurement department that don't have a category manager for, let's say, dry agricultural goods, which is probably not the most used.
Something random that you're going to use or buy one time in 3 years.
Exactly, right? And now through Tradeshift skills, you can actually activate such a service, and then you have access to exactly that knowledge. And that means that what I call the long tail of services in procurement can be very easily enabled. And the back-end providers, like the BPOs, the procurement consultancies, etc., they love this model because it allows them to consolidate volume and go out and serve the long tail. And I think it's essentially, it's not so different from Uber, really. It's just a marketplace of services. Right. But I think a marketplace of services is tremendously more valuable in the B2B world than even in the consumer world, right? So also back to my model or my comment that in 10 years from now, I do not think companies will have back offices like they have today. Right. So I believe a large part of the service delivery will be on demand. Right?
Yeah, I actually really agree with that. And, I've always thought about it from you mentioned like a category manager. Yeah. So there's no need for somebody to invest in a category manager or a sourcing lead that has very specific expertise that they need once every 3 years or once every 2 years. So the choices today is you have a generalist who doesn't really understand the market per se but can run the process, or you use a consultancy firm, or you use a procurement BPO firm. But this empowers an individual who's got very specific expertise in one thing to basically price themselves as an independent contractor based on the value they bring, not based on the time and materials, but also it allows a CPO to access them just once. Yeah. There was something this morning I actually read, I think it only came out this morning, an article, and I'm going to link up to it in the show notes, but there was a part at the end of the article, it was talking about your innovation day, that referenced enabling an on-demand, hyper-specialized economy. And so it kind of took the model that I had in my mind from an individual contractor or consultant perspective and applied it to your own purchasing organization or procurement organization. So you're Ford Motor Company and you buy steel, then why don't you buy steel for everybody else in the world? Because that's what you buy the best. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit, and if you really see that there's potential here, and that it's something that a CPO would look at and say, other people can buy things more effectively than I can, but I can also turn my organization into a profit center because I buy these things better than anybody else.
I think this is so interesting, and so that's the flip of what we just talked before, right? The services that maybe is not my core, you can just get on demand, and I'll take a very real example. I think it was last year at ProcureCon, I heard I was talking to DHL, and DHL is one of our customers, right? And their procurement department has started selling services centric to the logistics space.
Interesting.
Where they say we're the world's best buyers.
Yeah.
In this very thin vertical, nobody beats us.
Right.
So why don't we give access to that service to other companies, right? It's almost like the way that Amazon Web Services grew out because they had spare capacity. And said, why don't we? Because we're so good at cloud. Why don't we let other people use the cloud?
We do it more efficiently than anybody else can do.
So exactly that, and that was so. They were actually one of our leading thoughts for this was, why can't they people like DHL and your procurement department also bid skills into the platform? Yeah. So I think it will go two ways, right? You will. The long tail skills you don't use very often, you will get on demand, and where you have your core competencies, you'll bid the skills out in reverse. And start turning your procurement department into a profit center, actually, and growing, because what you're also growing is your access to volume, all of these things. So, yeah.
No, it's a very interesting kind of concept to see how it plays out, because obviously that's just a completely different mindset shift from you having everything under your roof to even, the next iteration is, well, I'm going to outsource. Well, actually, you're now outsourcing to people who could be your competitors.
Yeah, and obviously, there are things that needs to be figured out, and who do you want to work with and who don't you, right? And that, of course, DHL, that's also a choice they make, right? But I do think DHL is very smart because they're saying, even if you outsource to our competitors, it would actually be to our advantage, right? We make them more efficient, but we are still gaining the skills, we are still getting...
Yeah.
And I don't think, if you look at DHL, it's probably not be the bigger competitors ever using this service, but a lot of the smaller competitors...
Who aren't
truly really never will be a real market threat to them, right? Yeah. I think very clearly this is the future, and obviously, and that's the thing with Tradeshift. We are happy. I mean, we know the future is. I quoted William Gibson also at our Innovation Day. Is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, right? And it's the same thing with ideas that we're pitching to the market. Platform, connecting with all of your suppliers, using apps, this kind of skill model. And for 20% of the companies who are moving, who are agile, who are very strategic about it, this is very, very interesting.
Right.
Maybe for 80%, we're not ready for this yet. Yeah. We're still, and that's fine. Because I know
you hope that over time they'll have a
the market will obviously move, right? And I'd much rather be on that side of the market than trying to figure out all of this stuff 5 years from now.
Yeah, it's like the Geoffrey Moore curve of, you're working with people right now who are innovators. Well, at some point, these kind of concepts will become mainstream.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we've proven Tradeshift over the last 6 years many, many times that we can launch a concept to market and actually make the market pivot around some of those, right? We were one of the very first to extremely aggressively go in and say, no, it should be completely free for suppliers. I think there's maybe one holdout left that's not believing in that idea for, I think, what would be balance sheet reasons for SAP. But everybody else has sort of come to that realization. Yeah. When we started, I was told, you're insane. Yeah. Why should it be, even CPOs told me, why should it be free for my suppliers? And I said, you're getting it all wrong. It's your business case that you're hollowing out. Right. Who do you think pay for that, right?
Yeah.
And
it all goes back to you as a buyer eventually.
Of course, yeah. And so I think over time we've been very successful in launching these concepts, getting them out. We did the same with CloudScan, use of machine learning very early on, mobile first, apps and so on. So I think for us it's a continuation, and we know it takes time, but we also know that we much rather set the direction for the market than follow.
Right, exactly. The last part of our area of innovation I wanted to talk about today, and it's something that a lot of people talk about, and I think that as a function, as an industry, maybe we don't even realize or know what it means fully or what it's fully capable of, and that's the concept of RPA, robotic process automation, and bots. A couple of months ago, I know that you acquired they looked like a pretty young startup, Hyper, in the travel space. I want to talk about it more from a technology perspective as opposed to the product that they actually brought to market. But what is the future of RPA? And is it, we talk about bots and we don't really know what they mean. This seems like it's a bit of a hybrid. It's like part automation, part machine learning, part a live person behind the scenes who's pulling everything together.
Mm-hmm. I think AI and robotics is, of course, one of the most exciting fields right now in technology. And I, of course, always when there are exciting fields in technology, there's also a lot of hype around it. Yep. I think right now we may be seeing the summer and spring of bots. I think soon we will see the winter. But I do think that the potential and impact of AI is going to be massive on procurement, on buying, on back office processes. If you look at what we've been doing, so what we really liked about the hyper model was, there's really two places you can apply AI in the human interface, so when we're interacting, or that's Siri for you, Alexa if you're using Amazon, or in compression in the back office of the workload, right? And what Hyper did extremely well, and so in a way, travel is actually our first skill on the Tradeshift skills platform. And what Hyper did very well was to take the human input, saying, hey, I could just, like chat. And we found out that most people in the world, most executives especially, never use the travel software.
Right.
They have a piece of travel software called the Assistant, and their interface is called text messaging.
Yeah.
That's the travel software interface,
and
right?
If they don't like what the Assistant comes back with, they tell them to find something that they do like.
Exactly. So what Hyper did was exactly to interface that, saying, okay, we're just going to have a chat interface. But then AI grabs all of the content. So I want to go to New York for 4 days, stay in a hotel. I need a restaurant for Tuesday night. Should be nice because I have a business dinner, and could also rent a car back and forth from New York. So AI immediately scans that whole block, figure out what are all the key things you want to do, launch searches in the back end of hotel databases, launch searches into travel networks, pull all of that out in an agent, we call it an agent dashboard, for the human worker. So what it does is it compresses the workload for the human worker. So where the human worker comes in is, I just need to make a decision. These are the choices, right?
So they can provide the context.
Yes. So where AI can do an amazing job, I think, is compression of workload. I think in the B2B space, I don't think we're there yet for the user interface. And I actually think most people would rather not. I think humans do a better job of user interface. It can very quickly feel a little bit like Comcast's phone system trying to cancel your subscription if you're talking to a bot, right? So I think talking to a human, but using AI to automate workloads is the right approach.
And so then the machine learning then allows that over time to evolve and mature so that the workload on the human becomes even less, but it never completely goes away.
Of course. So that's for complex problems. I think, so you also mentioned robotics, and I just want to circle by while we are in the AI area. I essentially think, if you look at what robotics are doing, which is very simple automation, almost like macros on top of the user interface, right? If I used to see these 4 fields here, click here, or if not, click here, right? It's extremely simple stuff. And I think robotics and a lot of simple human decisions, yes, no, approve, reject, are all going to be replaced with AI, because that's where AI is extremely strong. Given a narrow field of decisions and a large set of data. And I think the problem with robotics and the whole robotics industry today is it's doing it on the top of the stack. So it's doing it on top of the user interface of existing legacy applications. And that's actually the most expensive point in the stack to apply intelligence, because you're going to sit down, you're going to make templates, macros. It's very hard. If you instead went to the transactional level, which is where the documents, they flow back and forth between the companies, and applied intelligence on that level, you only had to deal with the data. So you didn't have to deal with a full stack of software. And there's a little bit of a technical argument, but I think robotics as we know it today will be seen as a fad in 3 years from now, because AI is proving stronger and stronger for the year. And I think, again, back to my prediction that in 10 years there won't really be a back office as we know it today, I think 80-90% of transactional decisions will be made by AI.
So, and that's actually a good segue into the last question, because I've made a note as we're talking here. Final question, you talked about 10 years in the future, what the procurement organization could look like. Sum up everything that we've kind of talked about and say, what will it look like? Or what do you think it will look like? Where are we evolving towards?
I think that 10 years from now, the procurement division will be problem solvers and opportunists. They will be problem solvers by analyzing big data sets and seeing where value is not flowing fast enough. And it will be a value-driven focus, not a cost-driven focus. So you will look at where are there stones in the river of value that flows all the way out to the customer. And you can do that because you have an end-to-end perspective from the data, which you don't have today, right? I think that's the problem-solving aspect. I think there will be opportunists on the flip side, but because they will also see all the places where more value could be captured. Mm-hmm. And today we have siloed a lot of those decisions. So one area we have stuff like dynamic discounting and treasury management. Yeah. In another area, we're negotiating our contracts. Yeah. And those two parties are not talking together at all.
Independent of each other.
And my favorite example is the account payable department working on stalling payments to generate DPO. But what they're also doing is they're stalling data. For instance, what currencies that's being traded in.
Right.
And for a large company, you can sometimes make 5-10 times the money on having accurate real-time data for currencies than you can save on the account payable process.
You're kind of playing the currency markets at the same time as you're enabling a transaction.
Exactly. So I think procurement teams will be cross-functional teams of treasury people, data scientists, business development people, and people who have that kind of mindset for business optimization, right? And I think they will have to prove every year what was their contribution, not to the bottom line, but to the top line.
Interesting. Well, there's so much to go into there, but time won't allow it. So I think that there's obviously a lot of challenges for procurement coming, but so much opportunity, so long as we actually kind of see and take our procurement organizations in that direction rather than just maintain the status quo. Because maintaining the status quo means that we're more likely to become irrelevant, as we talked about before, rather than embracing some of these new technologies and the new opportunities to become more what we want to be. And we all want to be, I think, as a profession, somebody who's, thought of as a revenue generator. You're helping the company with whether its objective is, you're not there just saving 5% or 10%. That doesn't even drop to the bottom line eventually.
Yeah. So. And I think one final comment from me is that it might sound like through this whole discussion here, this stuff is complex, it's hard, it's far out in the future. And I really want to say it's not. And even though that it's a pathway, you can start in some very simple ways.
Right.
You can start by, when you're picking your next procurement system, to think about what's really our goals. And we deploy with customers today, not in 10 years from now, a lot of these technologies, right? And we help make the business cases around and help you sort of pivot the thinking. Same for account payable, the same for supply information management. All of this is available today. So it's not far future. Yeah. But it's the starting point that can get you to the far future, right?
It's kind of the building blocks.
Yeah.
Well, Christian, where would, if listeners would like to understand a little bit more, learn a little bit more, is there anywhere where you would direct them to, a website, a white paper? And what I'll do is I'll link up to that in the show notes for the episode.
So I think the very best place to start, if you're a company or working in a large company and you're thinking this is interesting, is to go to tradeshift.com and just click Enterprise.
Okay.
If you think some of the stuff we talked about around AI and robotics and skills and chat is interesting, you should go to tradeshift.com and you should click Tradeshift Go, because that's where all of that lives. And finally, if you're working for the technology department, a CIO or CTO, want to hear more about our platform, it would be tradeshift.com and apps.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's all there.
Well, I will link up to those in the show notes. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/tradeshift. That's artofprocurement.com/tradeshift. So, Christian, thank you very much for opening your doors to me today. It was great to do this in person, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
All right, thanks, Christian.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.